So now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Kate McBrien. Kate is the Deputy Secretary of State for Archives at the Maine State Archives in Augusta. But so before serving in this role, she worked at the Maine Historical Society and Maine State Museum in their curatorial and public engagement departments. At the State Museum, she researched and curated the award-winning exhibit, Malaga Island, Fragmented Lives, about the Malaga Island community. And we are thrilled to have her with us this evening. Kate?
Thank you so much, Marianne. I really appreciate it, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you all for having me. I am going to try to share my screen, so hopefully this will work, so that you can see a presentation. You can see some of the pictures of Malaga, which I think really helps to bring it to life. All right, can everybody see that? I think so. All right, well, thank you. Thank you all again for having me. What I hope to do tonight is provide you with a brief history of the Malaga Island community, the people who lived on the island and made it their home for almost 60 years. We'll get into a bit about the island itself, the people who lived there, and we'll certainly talk about how the community ended, how the state evicted them from their homes in 1912, and what was the lasting legacy from that. Malaga Island is located at the mouth of the New Meadows River, right in Phippsburg, Maine. It's only 42 acres. It's really a very small island, very rocky, covered in scruffy pine. It is located right next to Bear Island, near Horse Island, and really right in between Phippsburg and Harpswell. So both communities knew it very well. There's actually several theories for how the community who came to live on Malaga Island got there. Most of them trace back to one gentleman. His name was Benjamin Darling. He was an African-American man. We believe he was a former enslaved person. And he actually purchased Horse Island right next to Malaga in 1794. He married a white woman named Sarah Proverbs. And basically that's where their family lived. They raised a family on Horse Island until the mid-1850s when his family sold the island. From there, subsequent generations actually scattered to surrounding islands up and down the New Meadows River. Although records are not very clear, we believe Henry Griffin and his wife Tina were most likely the first to set up home on Malaga Island. They actually built a house on the east side of Malaga in, we think, around 1863. Very quickly, as soon as they landed there, a community grew up right around them, ending up on the north end of the island. The reason they were located on the north end is, as you can see from this image of the island, it's really the only place with a decent landing site. It has a beach and a relatively flat area for landing a boat. It's also the only protected sort of landing area, not open to the open ocean and harsh winds that can be experienced there. And life on Malaga Island was really the same as it was on most islands in Maine in the late 19th century. Members of this community you know, made a living fishing, doing whatever they could to earn a living, taking on side jobs from the mainland, working with the mainland community as much as they could. They were certainly poor, but like most fishing communities, they scraped by and managed to get by and support themselves for a number of years. However, they were different because they were African American and white people living together, creating homes together, and that stood out as different in 19th century Maine. It was not the socially accepted norm. It was seen as a bit controversial. And so many myths very quickly grew up around this community. myths that spread up and down the coast of Maine for years. They would tell stories about thefts and inbreeding and illiteracy within this community. There was actually a story in a local newspaper that the children on the island had blunted horns growing on their head, and they were living in tunnels under the island. There were even postcards, such as this one, that were sold nationwide that showed very pitiful scenes of the people who lived on the island. However, this is what reality looked like a little bit more. This family, the Murphy family, is sitting on their front porch of their home on Malaga Island. You can see they're not quite as scruffy. They're cleaned up. The typical family setting for the late 1800s, early 1900s. Families definitely struggled. I mean, they were poor, so life was not easy, but they built their homes, they cared for their children, they interacted with the mainland community, and they got by like most coastal communities at the time. In the early 2000s, University of Southern Maine archaeologists actually began an archaeological dig on Malaga Island. They dug at the site of 3 homes for a period of about 8 years, and they were able to uncover quite a bit of evidence of how this community really lived, and that's what tells us so much about how they survived on the island. They dug at the home of the McKinney family, the Griffin family, and the Eason family. As you can see, these pictures show the sites where the houses were located. These are actually shell middens, big mounds of processed shellfish that were left from Native Americans who'd used the island before this community even lived on there. This community built their homes right on top of these shell middens, and that's what the archaeologists were digging through. Their archaeological work found that generally the island community lived like most other Maine island communities at the time. They worked, they cooked meals, they cleaned their house. Much of their possessions were secondhand, like this spoon. Ceramics tended to be styles that were popular decades before. Although there were a few households like the Easons who owned this bowl, who actually owned some items that were very current and stylish for the early 20th century. They used clay pipes that were common in the 18th and 19th centuries. They found tons of these all over the island. Textiles, they found fragments of that, and shoes. And the fragments they found were so small, they were able to determine that this community, like most other communities that were economically struggling, they just were using up every last bit of things that they could. So I want to take a moment to really give you a closer look at who some of these people were so you can get to know them. Henry and Tina Griffin were, like I said, most likely the first family to move to Malaga Island. We think they settled there in the early 1860s. Henry Griffin actually came from an area of Small Point in Phippsburg called the Branch. Tina, she was born in 1809. She actually was the daughter of Isaac Darling, so granddaughter of Benjamin Darling, that first Darling patriarch that we talked about. She grew up on Horse and Bear Islands right next to Malaga. Her husband Henry in the census records was listed as a fisherman, just like most of the other people who came to settle on Malaga. The McKinneys, we think, were probably the second family to build their home on Malaga Island. James Eli McKinney was a white man. He grew up in Phippsburg. He married Salome Griffin. This was his second marriage. Salome Griffin was the daughter of Henry and Tina Griffin. So they built their home next to her parents on Malaga Island, very common. She, just like her mother, had spent her early years on Bear Island before the family moved to Malaga Island. The very first recorded birth on Malaga Island was Louisa McKinney. She was the daughter of James Eli and Salome. She was born in April of 1871. Now, there may have been earlier births on the island, but these things were not always recorded really well and preserved. So this is the first one that we can document. She actually married John Murphy and started her own family on Malaga Island, who you can see here. James Eli McKinney, by 1900, was known locally and to the press as the King of Malaga Island. This is a really common term in fishing communities. It usually meant the best fisherman. And that person sort of became the spokesperson for the community. I tend to think because he was white as well, he kind of became more of a spokesperson because the press would be more comfortable speaking with him in that leadership role. So I think that just kind of added to it, but that's my best guess. Newspapers suggested that Jim McKinney and then later on his son-in-law, John Murphy, they both held considerable power over the community and were really seen as leaders that a lot of people brought their concerns to. Jim McKinney was also very well respected for his talents playing the fiddle, and he performed up and down the New Meadows River area performing the fiddle. His obituary in 1916 actually described him this way. I'll read you a small quote. Quote, Jim McKinney was perhaps the most picturesque character that lived on the little Emerald Isle of Malaga. He seemed to possess a little more education than the others on the island, and they, accordingly, carried all their troubles to him, and he settled them, unquote. John Eason was another gentleman who lived on the island. This is another one of the households that the archaeologists dug at. John Eason was a stonemason and a carpenter, but just like everyone else on the island, he also fished. He was also known regionally for his singing voice, so he would perform in the area singing. He was also on the island, they nicknamed him the Deacon, because when the islanders couldn't make it to the mainland to attend church, he would actually lead them in a religious service. John Eason married Rosella Griffin, who was the granddaughter of Henry and Tina Griffin. They lived on Malaga Island. They actually married in 1886. You can see them here. What I love about this picture is until we could zoom in, I never realized that Rosella Griffin was holding a cat. So that's their pet cat in her arms. And this photograph is actually a very interesting one because we know the exact date it was taken. This was taken by a photographer named Herman Bryant. He was working out of Gardner, Maine at the time. And he visited Malaga Island in June of 1911. He took this photograph on, I'm sorry, he was there July, because he took this photograph on July 20th, 1911. And by having him write that date on this glass plate slide, we actually are able to know that only 6 days before he took this picture, newspapers reported that Maine's Attorney General had decided that Malaga Island was actually owned by the Perry family of Phippsburg. So just 6 days before this picture was taken, these people were told the state of Maine decided someone else owned the island where they lived. We also know that 11 days after this photograph was taken, the newspaper reported that the Perry family filed papers with the state to evict the community. So there's this little window here when these people had their photographs taken where they know someone else owns the island according to the state, but they're not quite sure what's going to happen yet. So it makes you wonder, what are they thinking when this photographer is showing up and asking to take their picture? So why was the state looking to see who owned the island? Why were they deciding these things and a family trying to evict them? Well, there's many different reasons. And of course, like most of history, a whole bunch of things have to come together at one time for something really big to happen. And that, unfortunately, is what happened for the Malaga Island community. There was a very rapidly changing economy in Maine around the early 1900s. We'd seen a decline in the shipbuilding industry, which was so prominent for the Phippsburg community. There was a very serious decline in the fish stocks that were hitting the fishing industry very hard. Remember, these were predominantly fishermen. And then as jobs disappeared between the shipyards and the fishing, more and more people throughout the coast of Maine were turning to their towns for assistance. This is before we had established systems for caring for the poor. what happened is you would, if you needed some help, you would apply to your town, and the town would support people. Well, as the town's economy grew worse, more and more of these people were taking a very larger portion of the town's budget. So it became more obvious to the community that there was need out on this island, just as much need as there was on the mainland of Phippsburg as well. Because of all of this, so many of Maine's coastal towns were turning to tourism as the new industry that would save Maine. That was the new industry that was going to take over from these other dying industries. While all of this is happening, nationally, the eugenics movement is on the rise. Eugenics is a scientific theory that is concerned with the purity of the Anglo-Saxon gene pool. Basically, the scientific theory believed that the social ills of a society could be passed down through the genes of a family. So if someone was an alcoholic, it got passed down through the genes, according to this theory. But they also expanded it to pauperism, to crime, to prostitution. They all felt that these types of behaviors were passed down through families this way. And there was a lot of research and theories about how to track this and then what to do about it as a society. Eugenicists believed that communities of feeble-minded people formed as these groups gathered, and the only way to really fix them was to disperse groups that were living in a very different, not socially acceptable way. It was actually under the eugenics movement that we now, some of the terms that we commonly use now, they actually came out of the eugenics movement. Things like moron, imbecile, as well as juvenile delinquent, those are all terms that grew right out of eugenics. As well as gifted child, looking at who was naturally smart, who was not, trying to track that through genes. These are scientific terms that were applied to people who society deemed unfit. And they created institutions like the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded in order to try to deal with some of these challenges for society, or at least what they saw as challenges. Around this, often associated with the eugenics movement, is missionaries. There were a lot of groups that began to form to try to fix some of these societal ills. And so missionaries from Massachusetts actually stumbled on Malaga Island and made that their pet project. Captain George and Lucy Lane, who you see here, they started working on Malaga Island during the summer of 1906. In fact, there was a letter that George Lane wrote to a friend a few years later. He wrote, I quote, "We built our summer house on the north end of Harbor Island, then Horse Island, and being interested in looking after people who need help, found what I was looking for on Malaga Island," end quote. The Lanes really focused their efforts on educating the school children of the island and teaching moral values, in their opinion, to the women of Malaga Island. They opened the island's very first school in 1906. They actually operated it from one room of the McKinney House, which you can see here. And it was their daughter Cora who served as the teacher for the kids that year. By the next year, the school had grown to 14 students, and the class actually had to move to the larger room of the McKinney House because it just was so popular. More and more kids wanted to attend. The Lanes then actively raised funds to build a permanent school on the island and to help pay for food and clothing for the islanders. They did so with enough success that by 1908, they actually opened this building on Malaga Island, and the state sponsored a full-time teacher to live on the island. At one point, there were 2 teachers. There was one to teach the academics, one to teach industrial arts, and then at other times, it was just one teacher. And this school actually became so successful that one mainland student paid tuition to attend the school. He would actually get on a boat and go to the island for school. As you can see here, the children received an education. They learned to read and write. They were taught mathematics and history. According to one letter I've seen, they were also introduced to some trades, some industrial trades as well. The letter that you see here is from Abby Marx, who was a child on Malaga. She was sending it to Mrs. Lane, asking if she would come to visit the island very soon. So in 1903, because of various reasons, because of the economy, because of the need for tourism, because this was a community who was living in a very different way that wasn't socially acceptable. It was in 1903 that Phippsburg actually tried to separate themselves from Malaga Island. Phippsburg petitioned the state of Maine, the state legislature, to say that they thought Malaga Island didn't actually belong within the town boundaries of Phippsburg. They tried to say that the island belonged to Harpswell. Well, that didn't work. Harpswell said no way, because that would mean that they were financially responsible for the community. The state also said no. They didn't think that was accurate. The island really did belong to Phippsburg. But what they did do was in 1905, the state made all the islanders on Malaga wards of the state, which meant that the state would make decisions for them, would pay for their food, their medical needs, and would sort of oversee the care that the state believed that they needed. To manage the resources and to care for the island, the Executive Council of the state of Maine appointed a Phippsburg resident, George Pease, to serve as the agent in charge of the Malaga Island community. And in 1911, he actually issued this report. This is just the last 2 pages of the report. He submitted it to the Executive Council in 1911. And within this report, he used very difficult and very racist terminology to describe the various families who lived on Malaga Island. He would go through each family who lived on the island. He would describe them, what he thought of as their work ethic, their level of intelligence. And then he also made recommendations on what he thinks should happen to each of the people. He described things like John Eason is 65 years old. He described his race, and he said he was average man of that age, rather intelligent. This is actually a quote. He said, he can do mason work, but lazy and won't work. Then he describes his wife, and he went through all these people. He described someone as feeble-minded. So again, using a lot of those eugenics-based terms. And as I said, he went through and recommended what should happen. His suggestion was that the state should own the island. He suggested that some families, like the Gomes families, some of the McKinneys, can be sent to various towns. He recommended paying a few people for their money, but not all of, some money for their homes and their land, but not all of them. He recommended that one family be sent to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. And he even suggested that a 2.5-year-old child, who was the child of Lizzie Marx, could be sent to Mrs. Hunt in Portland because she, quote, she wants the child. So interestingly, he even recommended that a few of the older residents could be left on Malaga Island. He actually says, and I quote, they are in poor health and probably won't live long anyway. So his recommendation was to just leave them there. So this was actually his official state report that he is presenting to the powers to be, the deciders at the state, recommending what should be done with these people. And what this tells us in so many ways is how they were viewing the people who lived on Malaga Island, how they were seeing them as a problem that had to be dealt with, not as individuals with personal needs. And they were trying to break up the community as much as they could. Soon after Pease's report was submitted, Governor Plaisted, who was governor of Maine at the time, visited Malaga Island with his executive council. And this was such an important moment because this story had been reported in newspapers across the country at this point. You know, as far away as Utah, Washington State, they were reading articles about Malaga Island. It was getting printed in popular magazines. So when the governor actually landed on Malaga Island, pictures were taken. This postcard was issued of the Executive Council landing on Malaga Island. He actually reported in a newspaper article the next day that he was very encouraged by the progress of the children at the school, but he also reported he was not convinced the community would ever accept a middle-class style of living. This is what he wrote, and I quote, "The best plan would be to burn down the shacks with all their filth. Certainly the conditions are not credible to our state, and we ought not to have such things near our front door. And I do not think that a like condition can be found in Maine, although there are some pretty bad localities elsewhere." Now, that's not quite what happened. Nothing was burned down. But very quickly after this, you know, this was July 1911. Within just a couple of months, the Perry family of Brunswick, they were decided to be the owners of the island, and they filed papers to have the islanders evicted. In the reports of the Committee of the Council for the State of Maine, an entire section is actually devoted to Malaga Island. The report states, I quote, "There has been heretofore, and some are existing at the present time, certain pauper colonies that have been for years a disgrace to the adjacent communities and a blot upon the state. We refer particularly to Malaga Island, Athens, and Frenchboro." The report actually described the decision to evict the islanders this way. After reviewing the conditions, it was decided at a council meeting very shortly after that for the good of the state and the cause of humanity, demanded that the colony be broken up. And that to prevent further squatting, the state decided that they should actually hold title to the island. So Portland and Boston philanthropists very quickly began working with the Lanes. They were very concerned about the Perrys trying to claim ownership to the island. And they worked closely to see what they could do to try to help. But this was done in a very, very much sort of top-down kind of way. They wanted to help the islanders, but they wanted to help the islanders in the way that they thought the islanders needed, not asking the islanders themselves. What tells me this is actually a letter in the Phippsburg Historical Society collection from Mrs. Hunt, who is one of the philanthropists working on behalf of the island community. She wrote, and I quote, "Dear Mrs. Lane, I think you ought to know that on Friday next, the governor and the council with 3 ladies are expecting to visit Malaga Island. We leave by special steamer at 9 o'clock. Please do not let the people on the island know of this visit, as I am anxious to have the men see conditions just as they are and without comment. It would be all right for Cora to have the children in the school building when we arrive. That might be the best way for the men to see them. I don't want them dressed up, but if possible, clean in general appearance. If we have them looking unusually well on the island, it might seem as if we had exaggerated their needs. But you and Mr. Lane can give the men just what they wish to know and information." So it was very much a, hey, here's a heads up, the governor is coming to visit the island. I don't know about you, but if the governor came to visit me at my house, I would certainly be doing some extra cleaning and I'd want to look nice that day. The philanthropist, Mrs. Hunt, did not want the island community to prepare themselves in any way. And so she was very much controlling the message that they would present. On December 9th, 1911, a local doctor who was also a member of Governor Placed's Executive Council signed papers committing 8 members of the Malaga Island community to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. It was Mrs. Anna Parker and the entire Marx family who went there. In that same month, the state purchased Malaga Island from the Perry family heirs for $471. Residents were told by the state that they had to vacate the island by July 1st, 1912. Some of them were given a token sum of money for their homes, but no alternative homes were suggested. They had to kind of find a new place all on their own. When Agent Pease arrived on the island on July 1st, though, he was there with the sheriff ready to evict everyone, but he actually found that the island had already been deserted. Everyone on the island had left by July 1st, and not only did they leave, but they took all of their houses with them. They dismantled them and moved them to any space that they could find on the mainland. At the end of 1912, after the eviction was completed, the state sold Malaga Island to the highest bidder for $1,650. So within just a year, they made some good money. The cemetery remains from Malaga Island were actually removed in November of 1912, just before the state sold it. And they took the remains of 17 people to the grounds of the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, now known as Pineland. They combined those bodies of 17 people into 5 plots, and that is where they were buried. You can still find these people buried there. There's small white stones marking their plots at Pineland. One family that was particularly devastated by Malaga Island was the Marx family. This is Jacob Conrad Marx. He was descended from a Darling. He and his family, who you can see here, he married Abby Darling, and they had 4 children. They were the family who were sent to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded in 1911. It was Jake Marx, Abby, Lizzie, Lottie, Etta, and James, and then Lizzie's son, William Marx. He was a toddler at the time. According to records from the school, all the Marx family members were diagnosed with eugenics-based diagnoses. They were diagnosed as either low-grade moron or imbecile, middle grade. These are all very scientific terms for the time period. Abby and Lottie Marx were actually the only Malaga Island residents to be released from the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. All the rest of their family members died there. Jake and James actually died pretty quickly. They were not there for even a full year before they left. They died. Etta and Lizzie, it took a little bit longer. Lottie was released in 1925. She and her mother Abby, when Abby was released, they moved to Bath, Maine, where they worked as maids in households there. You'll notice too that Willie Marx also died at the school. This is the toddler that in Agent Pease's report to the Executive Council, he had recommended that Willie Marx be given to Mrs. Hunt in Portland because she wants the child. Well, the state decided not to do that. They sent him to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. He entered the school before the age of 3, lived his entire life there. He died at the age of 19 at the school. Lottie, as I said, was released. She eventually married, but she never had any children of her own. She actually married a couple of times. She lived until the ripe old age of 103. She died in 1997 in a nursing home in Augusta. When people would ask her about her background, she would often talk about her Native American ancestry, never admitted to her African American heritage. She did actually ask to be buried on Malaga Island, but she was not. She was buried in Brunswick, is buried in Brunswick. And to her, of course, to her dying day, she denied ever being at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. She wouldn't acknowledge that time period. Other residents of Malaga Island scattered to nearby towns. They set up home where they could. Here you can see John Easton, who settled at Cundy's Harbor. This is a picture of him in 1934 with his dog. And I swear that house behind him looks exactly like the house that he had on Malaga Island. It may be the same one. So today, Malaga Island is a nature preserve. It's owned and maintained by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. It's open to the public, so anybody can go. The difficulty is you have to get yourself there. So usually a canoe or a kayak works really well. Sometimes Maine Coast Heritage Trust offers tours of the island as well. There's a nature trail that goes around the island, which is lovely. But there is a lot of poison ivy on the island, so I highly recommend if you go, stick to the trail. It's just a little bit safer. We have been trying to do, there's a group of us who've been trying to keep this story alive so that people can continue to learn from it. In July of 2017, a group of us dedicated a memorial to the people of Malaga Island. It was placed at the cemetery at Pineland, where so many of them are buried. And we also established a scholarship fund, established with funds from the state of Maine for the descendants of those evicted from Malaga Island. And I'm actually pleased to report that all of that scholarship money has been given away now, over $300,000, and sent numerous people to school and to further their education, which is wonderful. There are many, many more stories about Malaga. It's a very complicated story. So here are a few resources, which I'd be happy to email to anyone who would like to learn some more as well. I will admit, other researchers like, myself and others, we're continuing to research the story. We're constantly finding new information. This is part of history. It's slow to come to the surface, but slowly we're digging in more, and we're able to kind of uncover and piece things together more and more as the years go by. So we'll keep looking. In the meantime, if you have any information to share, or if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And Marianne has all my contact information as well. So if that's the easiest way to reach out, we'll be sure to answer your questions. So that's it.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Kate. Wow, it puts the Lizzie Bright book into context, hearing, this is really wonderful. Melissa has, are you there?
I am here. I don't know, no one sent me any questions directly for Kate at the moment, so now is your chance, everyone. If you've got some questions, please feel free to send them over to Questions for Kate, and we can go from there.
Yeah.
There's usually a few. It's a tough topic, and there's lots of different things going on at once. So feel free to ask questions, or if you need to sit and digest with it too, you can always reach out to me later.
Yeah. How long did you start? Did it take you to put all this together?
I first stumbled on the story of Malaga Island in 2001. So I've been working on it for, almost 20 years now. It's one of those things that, you kind of, you pick up and put down, and you find something more, or you meet someone else and a little more is connected. It was really more around 2010 that I was able to dig in more, and I found some more of the descendants of the community, and they really helped to bring the story to life in many ways.
How many descendants did you find?
There's hundreds. I actually first connected with them by stumbling on a Facebook group for descendants of Benjamin Darling. And I asked if I could join. I said, I'm not a descendant, but I'm researching, so maybe I can help you to find some information. And that's really what connected me with a lot of people. And that group is still growing. I mean, I think there's over 200 members of that group, and then there's plenty of other people who don't do social media, who are connected with the island too. But there's people all over Maine. There's people all over the country at this point.
Fabulous. I do have a couple of questions that have been rolling in now. So the first one is, what was the basis for the Perry claim to the island?
The Perrys, as best as I can tell, the state claims that the last deed they could find was for the Perry family. The problem with that is that the Perrys had a deed for the island from the early 1700s, and then there was nothing else. They didn't pay taxes on the island for decades. The community had lived on the island since the 1860s, and nobody seemed to care. I mean, everybody knew they were there. You can see Malaga Island from the mainland. Nobody seemed to care until the state really took an active interest. The Henry Griffin on Malaga felt that he owned the island, but he was never able to show a deed for it. And a lot of the philanthropists actually hired lawyers, and they were kind of wondering if it was more of like a squatter's rights. Once you've been there for decades, by default, do you own the island? But no one was able to settle that. So the state decided that the Perry family were the last known owners and stuck with that.
Interesting. And do we know, or were you able to find anything in your research about where those first families originally came from when they came to the island?
Most of them were related. They were mostly descendants of Benjamin Darling. So it was kind of like Henry and Tina Griffin first settled. Their daughter built her house with her family, and then a cousin came, and then a cousin of that person came. And so most of them are loosely connected through family connections. There was a couple of families that don't seem to have a family connection. One of them is the Gomes family. Frank Gomes was a Portuguese immigrant, and we really don't know how he ends up on the island, but he's there for a while. Mrs. Anna Parker is someone I've never been able to trace who she is, where she comes from, but she was on the island at the end, and she was one of the people put in the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. But most of these people are loosely related and descended from Benjamin Darling. As far as we can tell, he is a freed, enslaved person. There's lots of local myths about how he came to the area. No one's totally sure, but we believe he came from the Virginia area and somehow made it to Maine.
One question that looks like it came to me is that the story that ship captains used to leave their black concubines on the island. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
There's not. That was a local story for a number of years, but there's absolutely no truth to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would the earliest inhabitants before 1906 have any property ownership rights?
That was one of the things that the philanthropists who were working on their behalf tried to answer, but they were never able to settle that. And the correspondence that exists is pretty vague. You can see them asking the question, wondering if that's a possibility, but it never seems to get answered. So I've never been able to find a court case that shows that they were really trying to answer it. We do see there's a court filing at the Saginaw County Court that says the Perry family was filing to evict the community. And then there's nothing. And then suddenly it goes quiet. The state buys the island from the Perry family and evicts the community. So presumably, as we can tell from letters, people of means down in Portland were trying to hire lawyers, trying to get that answered. It's hard to see if they were really able to do anything about it, though.
And were there any families that kind of participated in trying to fight against being kicked off the island, or how much were they involved in that?
Yeah, some people had families on the mainland. Some of these people had lived on the island and then lived on the mainland for a few years, come back to the island, that kind of thing. So some of them had places that they could land, someone who had a little bit of extra room and they could move their house over to there. But these were generally, fairly poor families. They didn't have money to hire lawyers. and to fight the state. So they really weren't able to do anything about it. There's a few newspaper articles where they've been interviewed and quoted as saying, you know, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't know where I'm supposed to go. You know, if you can suggest a place for me to go, please let me know. But they weren't able to mount a successful fight against it.
Two questions that came in to me. One was, what was the most common question that people ask you? And the other one is, what is the most interesting question that you've been asked about this?
It's a good question. A lot of questions I get are either about some of the myths that exist about the island, because people have talked about the island for generations. So about either was Benjamin Darling, was he an enslaved person who saved the person who owned him in a shipwreck, and that's how he won his freedom. That's a really popular story that's out there. The other question I get often is was this community evicted by the state because of racism or because of economic problems and poverty? And I think that's where it gets complicated, because I think it's a little bit of both, and I think they're intertwined. I think there were plenty of other poor communities that were all white who did not get this kind of attention in the newspaper and in the state. So I don't think it's just the economy, but certainly the fact that we had a struggling economy at the time may have brought more attention to this community than they would have had otherwise. So those are some of the questions I often get.
Melissa, do you have some more?
I do. There's a question of, you know, in the bicentennial that we celebrate Maine entering the Union as a free state, and was there any understanding or responsibility to that when the governor and executive council made those decisions around the state?
Absolutely no mention of that at all. And Maine's history with slavery is really very complicated. You know, even though we entered the nation as a free state as part of the Missouri Compromise, it was still many Maine-built ships that were serving as slave ships and going to Africa and capturing people and bringing them back to America as part of the illegal slave trade. So Maine's been involved with slavery. We've had enslaved people in Maine in the 1600s and 1700s. So we've been involved with all of that. We just don't often acknowledge it. And we struggle with our relationship with that as a New England state, part of the North, and what is our history with it.
Someone else is asking if there are other communities like this within our state, and if they were treated similarly to this one.
I haven't found evidence of that. That's another common question I get. The Executive Council report, you know, mentions Frenchboro and Athens in Maine as other communities that are very concerning. It doesn't seem to be based on race, so I'm assuming it's more economics based, but I'm not positive. And it doesn't look like they were ever evicted and treated in the same way. So I haven't found a similar community in Maine. This is the only one. There were plenty of African-American communities in Maine. Actually, in 1850, Warren, Maine had the largest Black population in the state. Warren had a settlement area where people owned land, and then they were near Rockland and Camden, where there is a lot more work. You know, Portland always had a larger Black community. So we've had communities, but none of them treated in the same way as Malaga Island. There's none that I've found yet. And I say it that way because you do have to wonder what else is buried in the records. But I haven't come across another one yet.
A couple of questions that came in to me. One is the scholarship still active that you started?
It's not. It is, we've given away all the money. So that is done now.
And Mrs. Hunt that you mentioned, do you
Yes.
know her full name?
Augusta Hunt.
Oh, Augusta.
Yep, she lived in Portland. I don't know a lot about her, except that she was very active in a number of groups, including in a temperance organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Society.
Mhm.
So she was very active in the community, and obviously a woman of means because she was sending a lot of money to Malaga. There's lots of letters back and forth between her and the missionaries who worked on the island. So she seemed to have taken a really big interest.
And another question, has any of this history been incorporated into school curriculum in Maine?
There are lesson plans that are available, and even posters that have been shared with schools for them to hang in their classrooms. It's not part of the state mandated curriculum, but it is available to schools, and a lot of schools have taken an interest in that. Many schools will actually use the Lizzie Bright book as their jumping off point. A good way to, and it really is such a fabulous book. It's just such a great introduction. Well, it's not nonfiction. It helps to bring some of the issues to life. And so it's a great way to get kids introduced to the topic. And then schools are able to dive in a little bit more and say, this really happened in Maine. And so some schools have gone on field trips out to the island, to Phippsburg, that kind of thing. So it's slowly spreading. One of the most difficult parts, though, is that when you want to teach Black history in Maine, a lot of teachers are looking for Black history, and very often all they can come up with is Malaga Island. And that doesn't really encompass all the Black history of Maine. You know, we've had Black residents in this state, you know, the area that is the state, for 400 years now. And you hate for Malaga to be the only part of that history that students learn. So a group of us are trying to help expand that a little bit, but that will take some time.
Yeah. Right. Well, this is great. Melissa, do you have any more questions for Kate?
That's all that I have for tonight.
Well,
Fabulous.
thank you so much. There was one comment that the name Salome, Richard Strauss wrote an opera with this title, pronounced with emphasis on the last syllable. I checked online, and the accepted presentation is not Salome, but Salome.
Yeah, I've asked a lot of locals in Phippsburg, how would they pronounce it? And it's also, McKinney is the same way. Some people pronounce it McKinney, some say it's McKinney. And so there's a lot of, locally, there's a lot of variation. Actually, Malaga Island in Phippsburg, most of the locals call it Malago.
Oh.
So it all, so much, just like with anything in Maine, it all depends where you are as to how you pronounce it.
Mount Desert and Mount Desert.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Kate, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. This is really, you know, these times when we can't get together, it's nice to at least do it virtually. So we're so grateful you could bring us your program, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Take care.